Okay, let's get this started. It's 1 o'clock. I'm just going to assume most people are either at lunch or at the RX talk, which is where most people go to anyway. That's totally fine. I kind of wanted to be in that talk myself. Unfortunately, I don't have an option. So today we're going to just deep dive into material design. I want to talk through some of what I believe the motivation behind some of the decisions that they took. These are based on my understanding of the guidelines through the years, my own experience, and also some of the talks I've had with the design advocacy and the material team at Google itself. So a little bit about me. I'm a design partner at a firm in India called Uncommon, which essentially builds a lot of apps for people in India, like startups in India and Southeast Asia. I'm also an instructor with Casa.io. I've got a course on the same topic going on over there as well, so in case you guys want to follow up on some of the things we discuss here, you can do so over there. And I've been a Google expert for design since 2014. In fact, for the past 5 years, I've been speaking about design to developer audiences itself, something I really like to do because I actually write code myself. I still do it for a hobby. I used to do it professionally before. I truly believe that developers can play a huge role in the design process itself. So to understand material design, let's just take a complete trip down memory lane. So this is Android 2.2 itself. Essentially during the 1.x and 2.x days, we didn't really have any design kind of language or anything at all, right? In fact, most of the things that we saw would be, like the designs that we saw in applications would be things that other people would implement from other platforms that they were building for. So the Android app for a company would look a lot like the iOS app, would look a lot like the web apps. Back in India, a lot of it would look like the Symbian 60 apps, which are still popular over there. The only kind of consistency that you had across applications itself would be if the developer didn't bother to theme the application, so you'd find a lot of grays across the different applications itself. Then in 2011, Google hired Matthias Duarte from Palm, and we pretty much immediately started seeing a lot of changes come in. So Gingerbread, for example, got rid of some of the grays and the gradients that we had. And then just a few months later from that, we had Honeycomb and then ICS, where we started seeing patterns emerge in terms of action bars. We started seeing the action menus itself, fragments come in play. We had our first official design language, so to speak, which is Hollow. The Android developer website had design guidelines and recommendations for us. They were actually pretty good. I still use them at times when I talk about design. This was the first key step towards having a slightly more mature design platform for us because we started seeing applications actually have some consistency across them. And Google did a pretty much a tough job of essentially policing the Google Play Store itself. So what they would do is to ensure that the applications follow the guidelines as much as they could, they would have this carrot and stick kind of thing going on where they'd be like, you can't get featured on Google Play if you don't follow these guidelines itself. So if your navigation draw is going underneath your content and stuff like that, you can't get featured. Which is kind of useful, particularly when you're kind of forcing some of the bigger applications to behave the right way instead of just replicating the iOS style itself. And then Google I/O 2014 happened when we saw material design itself. There's a lot of excitement over there. People love the colors, the animations and stuff. And material design was like taken. A lot of people really loved it, like so much so that they actually won the 2014 User Experience Award for the best contribution to user experience itself. So the fact that Google needed a new design language wasn't a doubt, right? Like while Hollow was decent itself, it was an upgrade on what we had before. It didn't really get any love from the people who are the users, right? But I want to take a look at some of the goals that Google themselves says they had for material design that goes beyond just looks good. The first was the fact that you needed a design language that could scale across multiple different devices, right? Material design needed to work well for watches, it needed to work well for phones, it needed to work well for TVs, tablets, as well as for dashboards that are going to be there in cars through Android Auto itself. And additionally, they wanted a design language. These are their words for it, which is a language that synthesizes the existing principles of design with innovation and science. What they're essentially trying to say is that design itself is a very old field if you actually look at it. We've been designing things as humans since pretty much our first set of tools, right? And over the years, we've built up a ton of principles for design that continue to be used today throughout our products, digital as well as physical. In fact, the one book that almost every designer needs to read as a rite of passage is The Design of Everyday Things by Don Norman. It doesn't talk about digital products at all, and yet there's so much over there for us to learn about. This isn't to say that design languages, like other than material design, do not take these principles into account. It's just that at the time, the way that we would kind of take some of the real world affordances into the digital world would be through skeuomorphism. So for skeuomorphism, this is the iPad app from the time of the calendar application. And essentially what we did through skeuomorphism and through the early days of digital products itself would be to replicate the existing products that we have in the real world exactly over here itself. It made sense early on as people transitioned from physical products into the digital ones, but it didn't make sense after a certain time, right? Because what ended up happening was people never really used these physical ones anymore. We started having a lot of generations of people who never really used a calendar in the physical sense. Also, another thing that people would do through skeuomorphism would just be to have these really crazy decorations. So for example, they would have the stone pieces of paper at the corners, right? And this was for them good design. People started getting tired of this. People started getting skeuomorphism started getting a lot of slack. And what started taking, what in parallel was starting to gain a lot of traction was flat design. What people don't really know particularly well is that Microsoft was actually one of the leaders when it came to the movement towards flat design itself. So this is a screen grab from Windows Media Center from the XP days itself. You of course had the Zune, and you had the Metro UI from Windows 8 itself. For some reason, it's no longer called Metro UI. I have no clue why. I still personally prefer to refer to that since that's what most people called it. So on a scale of skeuomorphism to flat design, where does material design lie? So a lot of people talk about it as skeuomorphic. A lot of people talk about it as flat. The Wikipedia entry for flat design actually talks about material design having skeuomorphic elements itself. Personally, I think it lies much closer to flat design than skeuomorphism itself. It's not completely flat because of the fact that it has depth in it. But at the same time, skeuomorphism, I can't agree to that part of it because skeuomorph itself actually means for decoration. So the elements that are being used in material design are not there for decoration itself, they're there for a different reason. Now moving over to the principles of material design. So material design has three key principles. The first is material is a metaphor. And that essentially talks about the fact that we need to, as designers, take some of the real world affordances from physical products into the digital world. I kind of mentioned affordances, I think, a little before. What are affordances? They're essentially characteristics about any element, any object, such as the material, the weight, the appearance, and things like that, which kind of helps us understand how the object is going to behave. One of the greatest examples of really bad affordances is usually doors. So doors will often tell you whether to push or pull, and there's always people who do the opposite thing itself. There's actually good practices, established practices for design of doors itself, which essentially look like this. So when you want someone to pull it, essentially they suggest having vertical handles versus when you want them to push it, you kind of want horizontal ones. And preferably when you want them to push it, it should be flat. So in the digital world, particularly in material design, there are three key affordances that they use. The first is light. And through light, we are kind of talking about shadows itself. So these shadows essentially kind of indicate to the user how different objects in your digital interface behave with each other, how they're related to each other. For example, if you can make out that one object is slightly higher than the other one, you kind of know that it's probably more important. So human beings tend to think of an object that is closer to them as more important than the one that is behind. The other is surface. Surface essentially refers to the contents of the views that we have itself. So this means all the content that you will draw in over there, the buttons that you have, the texture that you might give to them and stuff like that. And then you have movement. The way an object moves can indicate a lot about its behavior itself. We'll discuss this a bit more in one of the next principles. So the next principle is bold, graphic, and intentional. Material design is essentially very, very inspired from print design. In fact, if you go through the guidelines, they talk a lot about print design itself. They talk about the material itself being a piece of paper. And this makes a lot of sense. So newspapers in particular are, like, you have a lot of people spending a lot of time designing newspapers in a really good way. The reason for that is newspapers have a lot of content on it, and you want to essentially indicate to the users how they should be consuming this content itself. Like, if you just didn't pay attention to design, it would probably just overwhelm the user. The key focus of newspapers is essentially to kind of create this kind of visual hierarchy for you that you kind of read through. So you go through the top to the bottom, the different sizes of text kind of indicate to you what is more important than the other. It kind of guides you through. So if you're just kind of really quickly perusing through the newspaper itself, it's great for that. If you want to kind of read deeply into a particular topic, they're capable of doing that as well. But ultimately, while material design is inspired very significantly through this, and they kind of talk to us about doing the same effort in our applications to have a user interface which allows users to just glance through the content very easily, the primary focus recommended by material design for us is to focus on the actions itself, right? So when you're on a screen, it should be very easy for you to understand what you can and cannot do on that particular screen. You want to guide the user in the right way. The third principle of material design is motion provides meaning. I touched upon this slightly earlier. Essentially, material design doesn't want you to just animate things for the heck of animating it. We are not going back to the days of Flash websites itself. Instead, the focus of animations needs to be on conveying information to the users itself, getting them to understand your environment. And the first basic principle of this animation is to kind of indicate to the user that they are the center of all interaction. So as an example of it, I don't know if you can see it clearly or not, but it's essentially the ripple effect. And the idea of the ripple effect is that the animation needs to begin at the point at which the user interacts with the screen itself. And it's not just in the ripple effect. When you see the menus being opened up in a material design application, they open up right over where a person taps on the screen itself. Shared element transitions are there for that reason as well, that they need to begin at the point at which a user has interacted. Shared element transitions also indicate something else, which is a key part of animation in material design, which is continuity. So the idea that users shouldn't have to essentially think through the fact that this is screen A, this is screen B, this is screen C, and stuff like that. If they tap on a particular element like this one in this grid, and it's going to be there in the next screen as well, you probably want to show kind of a transition that takes this element from the previous screen to the next one itself. This makes things a lot easier for the user to understand the change in the environment as they move through. You also want to focus on the choreography of individual elements itself. So over here, you'll notice how the floating action buttons move between the screens itself. So as this card comes up, the floating action button kind of disappears because something else is coming above. But at the same time, as this one comes in over here, the favorite button comes in slightly late. So the choreography of material design's animations is also really vital to the true experience itself. Now, moving forward, if you've actually seen over the past few years, like I talked about how Google pushed through Hollow to a lot of users, essentially saying that you need to follow the guidelines to be essentially be featured on Google Play itself. They're actually, what I've noticed is they've kind of started going away from that. They're not kind of indicating to you that you have to use this particular pattern, you have to use this view that looks exactly like this or that. Their focus instead now is on getting you to think through how you want to design an interface yourself, not think through how exactly it should look according to their guidelines, and instead focus on essentially how a material should behave based on their rules itself. And the kind of rules that they've given, I'm just going to cover them, are the properties of this material itself. Now, the first property of a material is that it's 1 dp thick. So this essentially means that we all know that a material exists in a 3-dimensional environment, right? Kind of looks like this. So a lot of times we spend our time looking at interfaces in this kind of way. Now, while a material can be as wide and tall as it needs to be, it's only going to be 1 dp thick. So it should not be 2 dp thick. So this allows a lot of movement between materials up and down itself. One of the key things of this, however, is the fact that materials can no longer fold. They cannot essentially flip around and stuff like that. They can't be slanted. They have to be plain in one particular plane itself in the z-axis. So, like I said, it can't do flips like this anymore. The next property is the fact that a material occupies a unique point in space. So, coming back to this again, a material sheet essentially is going to occupy, like any one particular x, y, and z coordinate is going to be occupied by one single sheet. And this is something we see in the physical world as well. You don't have multiple objects occupying the exact same point. However, the main impact that this has on your design itself is the fact that materials are now impenetrable. So you can't have a material that kind of passes through the other one itself. So if I have this over here, if you notice it, you can't have a sheet that kind of just passes through the previous one. They're not ghosts anymore. So if you kind of have a material that needs to rise from behind to above, the one on top needs to either disappear or it needs to make way by sliding down or up and stuff like that itself. Materials are immutable. So this essentially means that a material that you have, a sheet that you have, can change shape, it can change size, it can move about as much as required, it can move off the screen as required. Again, just keeping in mind the fact that it can only be 1 dp thick, it can't essentially, it needs to move across the z-axis firstly as a whole. It can't be like one part of it moves down first and then the other one does. It can't fold like I mentioned earlier. And that materials can join, split, and heal with other sheets as well. So this one is actually pretty interesting and we see it quite often. If you have any two different pieces of content, different pieces of sheets that you have, you might want to join them for any particular reason. So an example for this could be a to-do list application where you have like a collection of tasks that are up above, which are like your overdue tasks, and you have some tasks below which are for today. As soon as you move past midnight, these tasks are now overdue itself, so they can move up and join the sheets that were there on top itself. And regarding healing, this is essentially that's something we see quite often when we have like a drag and drop in our list itself. A sheet of material can essentially split from a bigger card that was behind it, rise up, move about independently as required, and join back at a different position if it needs to be. And finally, material can be destroyed and created as required. So if you go back to some of the original third-party libraries that we had of the floating action button itself, when we want to hide them or move them across the screen to essentially indicate that they're no longer required, what would typically happen is the floating action button would move off the screen. It would kind of slide down itself. If you notice some of the newer libraries, in fact the design support library, the thing that they have for hide is the fact that it kind of disappears over there itself. So the idea of that is you don't have to necessarily create all your sheets of material right in one go in the beginning and keep them somewhere off the screen, or they need to move off the screen itself. If a material is no longer required, you can just make it disappear completely. So just animate that to disappear over there. Now just putting all of these material properties together, and I talked about how they're kind of moving away from being very strict about the guidelines in terms of how things should look. I'm going to touch upon one particular topic that got a lot of heat last year itself, which is the bottom navigation, right? This is a great example of essentially Google telling us, like indicating to us that It's not a case of how objects should appear, but it's about how they should behave. If you go through the guidelines of the bottom navigation, it's completely in line with the material properties in every way that we talk about it, right? It's only 1 dp thick. It can mutate as required as you move through different elements itself and things like that. It draws shadows accurately. If it's not there, if it appears later, you can make the floating action button move up or down as required and things like that. Why this is so important is that for a very long time, a lot of the designers and companies themselves would talk about material design being very template-ish itself. That you kind of have applications that look very similar to one another as a result of the guidelines that Google has put forth to us. This kind of leaves a lot of room for us as designers to be more creative, as long as we stay within the properties of material that we just talked about right now itself. It allows us to do whatever we need to. We can have, if you don't want a bottom nav, if you want a bottom nav that looks different, that's totally fine. Ultimately, what we obviously want to do is make sure that users can understand it. For that reason, it kind of makes sense to be very similar to the more common patterns itself. But when it needs to change, you kind of need to change it. And that comes to the final qualifier that I have in my talk. This is something that I always say at the end of any material design talk, which is that deviate with purpose. So, and in the case of any application itself, in the case of any design itself, you don't want to be constrained by the guidelines. The guidelines are just that, they're guidelines. So in case you have to change the design, in case it's not working for your users itself, it's totally fine to change it around. What you're doing is not trying to impress the people within the material team, you're trying to impress your users. You know your users more than Google does itself. You're seeing this happen a lot in India, for example. The reason for that is a lot of people in India believe that the material design properties may not necessarily communicate well enough with the users in India. The reason for that is a lot of these people have never really used a digital product in their life so far. So that's why you still see a lot of the older design principles in play in India itself, as more people are moving from the digital world to the physical world itself. So deviate with purpose when it makes sense for you to do so. And that's it from me. Free to take any questions right now. That's my Twitter profile in case you want to catch up later and stuff like that.